What if I told you that the people we send into space come back different? Not just in what they've seen, but in who they are, down to the very cells of their bodies, the rhythm of their hearts, the way their bones remember gravity. Welcome back to the Sleep Labs. Tonight we're talking about astronauts. Not the mythology, not the heroic narratives we've built around them, but the reality. The 100 strange, beautiful, and unsettling facts about what it means to leave Earth and return changed. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll never think about space travel the same way again. Before we begin, sleepy friends, I'd love to know a little bit about you. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Are you tucked into bed, drifting towards sleep, or just unwinding after a long day? Share a little about your corner of the world in the comments. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. From city lights to quiet countryside, from midnight to sunrise, we're all looking up at the same sky. So take a deep breath, get comfortable, and let's drift together into the calm, quiet edges of space, one fact at a time. Let's start with something simple, something most people don't realize. Fact 1. Astronauts grow taller in space. Not metaphorically, literally. Without gravity compressing the spine, the vertebrae spread apart. The discs between them expand, filled with fluid that on Earth would be compressed by your body weight. And over the course of a few months on the International Space Station, an astronaut can gain up to 2 inches in height. It sounds like a gift, like something you'd want, until you realize it comes with chronic back pain. The muscles and ligaments aren't designed for this elongation. They stretch beyond their normal range, creating constant discomfort. The spine curves differently. Nerves get pinched. And when the astronaut returns to Earth and gravity reasserts itself, that height disappears, painfully, slowly, over the course of weeks. The vertebrae compress again, the discs deflate, and the astronaut shrinks back to their original height. It's like the universe reminding them where they belong, that they were never meant to escape its pull. Fact 2. Your heart changes shape in space. On Earth, gravity pulls blood downward, pulling it in your legs and lower body. Your heart works against this, pumping upward, maintaining pressure in your brain, your arms, your upper body. It's a constant battle, one your heart has been training for since before you were born. In microgravity, that resistance disappears. Blood distributes more evenly throughout the body. There's no up or down, no pooling, no pressure gradient, and over time, without that constant workload, the heart becomes more spherical, less efficient. It doesn't have to work as hard, so it doesn't. Cardiac muscles atrophy, just like skeletal muscles do. The heart literally forgets how to pump as hard. And when astronauts return to Earth, their hearts have to relearn how to work against gravity's pull. For some, this readjustment is quick. For others, it takes months. And some astronauts never fully recover their pre-flight cardiac efficiency. Their hearts remain changed, permanently altered by the time spent in an environment the human body was never designed for. Fact 3. Astronauts lose bone density faster in space than osteoporosis patients do on Earth, about 1 to 2% per month, concentrated primarily in weight-bearing bones. The hips, the spine, the femurs, all slowly dissolving. The mechanism is straightforward and brutal. Bones are living tissue, constantly being broken down and rebuilt in a process called remodeling. On Earth, the stress of supporting your body weight signals the bones to maintain their density, to stay strong. In space, that signal disappears. The bones don't need to support weight anymore, so the body starts breaking them down, leaching calcium into the bloodstream where it's filtered out by the kidneys. And even with hours of exercise every day, even with carefully designed resistance training that tries to simulate the loads bones would normally carry, the loss continues. It's relentless. Astronauts can see it in their blood work. Elevated calcium levels, markers of bone breakdown. Some of this density comes back when they return to Earth, as gravity reminds the bones they're needed again. But some of it doesn't. Some of that loss is permanent. And for astronauts who spend a year or more in space, the implications for long-term health, for fracture risk as they age, are significant and still being studied. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what space does to the body, we should talk about who gets to go there in the first place. Fact 4. Fewer than 600 people have ever been to space. Out of the 100 billion or so humans who have ever lived, out of the nearly 8 billion alive today, fewer than 600 have left Earth's atmosphere and seen the planet from the outside. That's roughly the population of a small village. You could fit every person who has ever been to space into a few city blocks. And of those 600, only 12 have walked on the moon. 12 people out of all of humanity have stood on another world and looked back at Earth hanging in the black sky. The exclusivity is staggering. Space remains one of the most inaccessible places humans have ever tried to reach. It's not like climbing Everest, where thousands have done it. It's not like crossing Antarctica, where at least hundreds have made the journey. Space is different. Space requires nation-states, billions of dollars, decades of training, and even then, most people who want to go never will. The odds are vanishingly small, and that makes every person who has gone there part of an incredibly rare club, whether they wanted that distinction or not. Fact 5. The first astronaut selection process, NASA's Mercury 7 in 1959, started with 508 candidates. They were all military test pilots, drawn from the ranks of men who had already proven themselves willing to risk their lives in experimental aircraft. All men, because that was the only option considered at the time. All under 40 years old, because age was seen as a liability. All with extensive flight experience, because NASA needed people who understood how to respond when systems failed. By the end of the screening process, which included brutal physical and psychological tests designed to identify any weakness, any flaw, any reason to disqualify someone, only 7 remained. They were poked, prodded, spun in centrifuges until they blacked out, locked in isolation chambers for hours, subjected to temperature extremes, given psychiatric evaluations that dug into their childhoods, their relationships, their fears. The goal wasn't just to find the best pilots, it was to find people who wouldn't break under conditions no human had ever faced. People who could sit in a tiny capsule on top of a rocket and remain calm when every instinct screamed to run. People who could make life or death decisions in seconds while traveling faster than anyone in history. And even for the 7 who made it, the testing never really stopped. They continued to be evaluated, monitored, studied, right up until the moment they launched. Fact 6. Early astronaut selection criteria were absurdly specific, shaped by the limitations of the spacecraft they'd be flying. Candidates had to be under 5'11" because the Mercury capsule was so small that taller men literally wouldn't fit. They had to have perfect vision, 20/20 or better, because there was no room for glasses in a pressure suit and contact lenses weren't trusted yet. No history of motion sickness, because vomiting in a sealed helmet in zero gravity could be fatal. No fear of enclosed spaces, because the capsule was barely larger than a phone booth and you'd be sealed inside for hours. No psychological red flags, no history of panic attacks, no indication of anything that might compromise judgment under extreme stress. And they had to be willing to sit on top of a rocket filled with hundreds of thousands of gallons of explosive fuel, knowing that the previous test launches had a tendency to explode on the pad, to veer off course, to disintegrate in the air. The mortality rate for test pilots was already high. Becoming an astronaut meant accepting even greater risks, and doing it publicly with the eyes of the world watching. Fact 7. The psychological screening was invasive in ways that would probably be illegal today. Candidates were shown disturbing images, violent scenes, sexual content, and their reactions were measured, analyzed, picked apart. They were asked deeply personal questions about their childhoods, their marriages, their fears, their dreams. They were given personality tests like the Rorschach inkblot test, where psychologists tried to divide. Fact 8. Modern astronaut selection is even more competitive, and the requirements have expanded beyond just piloting skills. When NASA announced openings in 2021, they received over 12,000 applications from people all over the country. Scientists, engineers, physicians, all with advanced degrees and exceptional qualifications. They selected 10. That's an acceptance rate of less than 0.1%, making it statistically harder to become an astronaut than to get into Harvard, Yale, or any other university on Earth. And the selection process now looks for different qualities than it did in the early days. Yes, physical fitness matters. Yes, technical skills matter. But NASA also wants people who can work in diverse teams, who have emotional intelligence, who can handle months of isolation with grace. They want generalists who can fix a toilet one day and conduct a complex scientific experiment the next. They want people who won't crack under pressure, who won't create interpersonal conflicts that could jeopardize a mission. And they want people who represent the diversity of humanity, because the narrative has shifted from conquest to exploration, from proving dominance to expanding knowledge. Fact 9. The training takes years, and it's designed to prepare you for everything that could possibly go wrong. Even after you're selected, even after you've beaten 12,000 other candidates, you spend at least 2 years in basic training before you're even eligible for a flight assignment. You learn Russian because you'll be working with because half the International Space Station is Russian modules. Because if something goes wrong, you need to communicate clearly with no room for misunderstanding. You learn how every system on the spacecraft works, not just at a conceptual level, but mechanically, electrically, chemically. You need to be able to troubleshoot a malfunctioning carbon dioxide scrubber or a water recycling system at 3 in the morning, when you're exhausted and ground control is trying to talk you through a repair. You train underwater in a massive pool called the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory, wearing a spacesuit, practicing spacewalks that can last 6 or 7 hours. The water doesn't perfectly simulate microgravity, but it's close enough. You learn how to move in the suit, how to handle tools with thick gloves, how to work methodically when every motion requires effort. You practice emergency procedures until they become reflex. Fire on the station. You don your mask and grab the extinguisher. Depressurization. You seal the hatches and find the leak. Ammonia leak. You evacuate to the Soyuz. Over and over until you can do it in your sleep. And then you wait. Some astronauts wait a decade or more for their first flight, training constantly, staying ready, aging slowly out of the program. Fact 10. Not everyone who trains actually flies, and that's one of the hardest truths about the astronaut cause. Some astronauts spend years in the program, go through all the training, maintain their qualifications, support other missions from the ground, and never get assigned to a flight. They work as mission control, as backup crew, always ready, never called. The reasons vary. Maybe they're too valuable in a support role. Maybe younger astronauts get priority. Maybe their skills don't match the missions being planned. Maybe they just got unlucky, caught in a gap between missions or budget cuts or policy changes, and eventually they age out or leave the program, having dedicated years of their life to a dream they never quite reached. Some make peace with it, finding meaning in the support work, knowing they helped other missions succeed. Others struggle with the disappointment, with the sense of having come so close, and all of them watch as their classmates fly, as the people they trained with go to space, and wonder what it would have been like to go themselves. Now, let's talk about what happens when you actually leave the planet. Fact 11. The journey to space takes about 8.5 minutes, and they're the most violent 8.5 minutes of your life. That's how long it takes a rocket to accelerate from 0 to over 17,000 miles per hour and reach orbit. From a standstill to faster than a bullet in less time than it takes to soft boil an egg. During those 8.5 minutes, astronauts experience forces up to 3 or 4 times Earth's gravity, sometimes more depending on the trajectory. Your body weighs 3 or 4 times what it normally does. If you weigh 150 pounds on Earth, you now weigh 600. Your chest compresses under the weight. Breathing becomes difficult, labored, each breath requiring conscious effort. Your face sags, skin pulling down, vision narrowing at the edges. Blood pools in the lower parts of your body. Your heart struggles to pump against the increased load. And if you're not in peak physical condition, if your cardiovascular system can't handle the stress, you could pass out. You're lying on your back in a seat molded to your body, unable to move, pinned by acceleration. Watching through the window or on screens as the sky transitions from blue to black. And through it all, you're aware that beneath you are tons of rocket fuel burning at thousands of degrees. That you're essentially riding a controlled explosion into the sky. That if anything goes wrong, you have seconds to react before catastrophe. Fact 12. The moment you reach orbit and the engines cut off, you're immediately weightless, and the transition is jarring. There's no gradual reduction, no gentle fade from gravity to microgravity. One moment, you're being crushed by 3 or 4 times your weight, pressed into your seat, barely able to lift your arms. The next moment, the engines shut down and you're floating weightless, your body suddenly freed from the crushing force. And for most astronauts, the first response is nausea. Space adaptation syndrome, a polite name for what is essentially severe motion sickness. About half of all astronauts experience it to some degree, and for some it's debilitating. Vomiting, disorientation, cold sweats, dizziness. Your inner ear, which relies on gravity to tell you which way is up, suddenly has no reference point. The fluid in your semicircular canals floats freely. Your eyes tell you one thing, your vestibular system tells you another, and your brain receives conflicting signals it can't reconcile. The result is motion sickness on a scale most people never experience on Earth, and there's nowhere to escape it. You can't step outside for fresh air. You can't lie down in a dark room until it passes. You're in a spacecraft, strapped into your seat, and you have work to do, checklists to complete, systems to verify. So you fight through it, swallowing repeatedly, breathing carefully, trying not to think about how wrong everything feels. Fact 13. Some astronauts adjust to weightlessness quickly, within hours or a day, but others take much longer, and a few never fully adapt. They spend their entire mission, weeks or months, fighting nausea, forcing themselves to work through the constant discomfort. Every movement triggers it. Looking out the window makes it worse. Even closing their eyes doesn't help, because the sensation of spinning, of falling, persists. There's no cure, no medication that reliably prevents it. Some anti-nausea drugs help a little, but they make you drowsy, slow your reaction time, which is dangerous when you're operating complex equipment. So mostly you just have to wait for your brain to recalibrate, to accept this new reality where up and down are meaningless, where you're always falling but never landing. And even astronauts who adapt quickly report occasional waves of nausea triggered by sudden head movements or unusual visual cues. The adaptation is never perfect. Your brain is constantly trying to make sense of an environment it wasn't designed for. Fact 14. Once you adjust to weightlessness, eating becomes complicated in ways you never anticipated. Food floats, obviously, but so do crumbs, droplets, particles. Everything not anchored drifts. Liquids form spheres, perfect globes held together by surface tension. And if you're not careful, they'll float away and collide with equipment. Crumbs are genuinely dangerous because they can float into ventilation systems, into your nose and mouth where you might inhale them, into sensitive electronics where they can cause short circuits. So most food is either sticky, like peanut butter, or packaged in pouches that require a straw, or freeze-dried and rehydrated into a paste. Bread is forbidden because it creates too many crumbs. Tortillas are used instead, and astronauts quickly learn to eat carefully, slowly, deliberately. Each bite has to be controlled. You can't just shovel food into your mouth. You have to capture it, guide it carefully. Chew with your mouth closed, because opening too wide means particles escape. A single sneeze during a meal can send food particles everywhere, coating surfaces, floating through the air, creating a cleanup nightmare. So meals become exercises in patience and precision, nothing like the casual dining we take for granted on Earth. Fact 15. Astronauts lose their sense of smell in space, or at least it diminishes significantly, and this affects everything about how they experience food. The lack of gravity means fluids don't drain from the sinuses properly. Without that drainage, you end up with a permanent, stuffy nose feeling, like you have a cold that never quite goes away. Your nasal passages are congested with fluid that has nowhere to go. And because so much of taste depends on smell, because flavor is actually a combination of taste buds and olfactory receptors, food becomes bland. Everything tastes muted, less vibrant. Astronauts describe eating as more of a necessity than a pleasure. You eat because you need calories, because your body requires fuel, not because the food is particularly appealing. Hot sauce and strong spices become staples on the space station, not for variety, not for heat, but just to taste anything at all. Astronauts douse their food in Tabasco, in horseradish, in anything that can penetrate the dulled senses and provide some indication of flavor. And even then, even with heavy seasoning, meals remain one of the less enjoyable parts of the daily routine. Food is fuel, nothing more, and the joy of eating fades into memory. Fact 16. Sleep is difficult in space in ways that go beyond just the physical environment. There's no up or down, so you strap yourself into a sleeping bag attached to a wall, or the ceiling, or the floor. The orientation doesn't matter, but the bag does, keeping you from drifting around while you sleep, keeping your arms from floating up in front of you in the default neutral body position that microgravity creates. You wear a mask because the sun rises and sets 16 times a day in orbit, once every 90 minutes as you circle the Earth, every 45 minutes sunrise, 45 minutes later sunset. The cycle is relentless, and your circadian rhythm, evolved over millions of years to respond to Earth's 24-hour day-night cycle, doesn't know what to do with it. Your body can't adjust to 90-minute cycles, so you use artificial darkness, blackout shades on the windows, masks over your eyes, trying to create a normal sleep schedule in an abnormal environment. And even with the mask, even with the exhaustion of working long hours in a demanding environment, many astronauts struggle with insomnia. The constant noise of ventilation systems, fans running all the time to circulate air that otherwise wouldn't move. The slight vibration of the station, imperceptible during the day but pronounced in the quiet of sleep time. The knowledge that you're hurtling through space at 5 miles per second, that outside is vacuum and radiation and temperature extremes. All of it adds up, creating a low-level anxiety that makes deep sleep difficult. Fact 17. Dreams change in space, and many astronauts report that their dream content shifts in strange ways. Some dream they're falling, that sensation of dropping that jerks you awake on Earth. Except in space you wake up and realize you are falling constantly in orbit around Earth. The dream and reality blur together. Others dream of gravity, of weight, of the simple pleasure of putting a cup down on a table and having it stay there, of walking without bouncing, of water flowing downward instead of clinging to surfaces. These mundane Earth experiences become precious in dreams, symbols of home, of normalcy. Some astronauts report vivid, intense dreams, more vivid than they've ever had on Earth, possibly related to the stress, the disrupted sleep cycles, the strangeness of the environment. And occasionally, astronauts report dreams that incorporate the reality of their situation. Dreams where they're floating through the station, where they're outside on a spacewalk, where Earth hangs in the window, and they wake up uncertain whether they're still dreaming or if this is real life. Fact 18. The view from space is overwhelming in a way that no photograph can capture. And astronauts often talk about the overview effect, a cognitive shift that happens when you see Earth from orbit for the first time. You see the entire planet at once, or at least a significant portion of it. The thin blue atmosphere, just a delicate shell protecting everything alive. Swirling cloud patterns, hurricanes forming, weather systems moving, oceans vast and blue, continents brown and green, and no visible borders, no lines drawn between countries. No indication from space that humans have divided this world into territories and nations. From orbit, Earth looks like one place, one system, one home. And that realization changes you. Many astronauts become environmental advocates after returning. They describe feeling a profound connection to the planet, a realization that all of human history, all our conflicts and achievements and struggles and triumphs happen on that small blue sphere, that everything we've ever known, everyone we've ever loved, every war ever fought, and every peace ever made happened there on that tiny world suspended in the vast dark. Fact 19. But the view from space can also be unsettling, and not all astronauts report the overview effect as purely positive. You can see cities at night, vast networks of light spreading across the dark surface, and from orbit they look like circuitry, like the planet has been wired. You can see deforestation, patches where jungle used to be, now brown and bare. Desertification spreading like a stain. The scars of human activity are visible from space. Strip mines, clear-cut forests, rivers choked with sediment. You watch. Hurricanes form and spin, beautiful and terrible, knowing that below they're destroying communities, killing people, and from space they're just elegant spiral patterns in the clouds. You see lightning storms flashing beneath you, entire weather systems reduced to silent light shows because there's no sound in space, no thunder, and you realize how fragile everything is, how thin that layer of atmosphere really is, maybe 60 miles from the surface to the edge of space, and most of it is in the bottom 30 miles. It looks like a soap bubble coating the Earth, impossibly delicate, and you understand how easily it could all go wrong, how vulnerable we are, how the only thing standing between us and the void is that thin shell of gas. Fact 20. Some astronauts see their own mortality differently after spaceflight, and this psychological shift is profound. You're separated from Earth by a few inches of metal and plastic, by the hull of the spacecraft, and nothing more. Outside is vacuum, instant death. Outside is radiation that would kill you in hours. Outside are temperature swings from boiling to freezing depending on whether you're in sunlight or shadow. One small malfunction, one tiny breach in the hull, and you die. Not eventually, not after a rescue attempt, but immediately. Your blood would boil, the air would be sucked from your lungs, you'd lose consciousness in seconds, and living with that awareness for months, being constantly aware that death is just a thin wall away, changes how you think about risk, about safety, about what matters. Some astronauts report becoming more cautious after returning, more aware of dangers in everyday life. Others become less afraid, reasoning that if they survive space, Earth's risks seem manageable. but almost all report a shift in perspective. About death, about mortality, about the preciousness of life. When you've seen how easily it could all end, how close you've been to the edge, it's hard to take life for granted anymore. Now let's talk about the daily realities of living in space. The things that sound trivial but become defining features of the experience. Fact 21. Going to the bathroom in space is complicated, awkward, and something astronauts dread discussing but can't avoid. There's no gravity to pull waste down, so toilets use suction. Powerful fans that create airflow to pull everything toward the collection system. You have to position yourself carefully over the opening, use thigh straps to hold yourself in place, and hope everything goes where it's supposed to. The opening is small, much smaller than a regular toilet, maybe 4 inches in diameter, and aim matters. Training for this involves cameras, feedback, practice sessions where you try to center yourself over a target. It's humiliating but necessary, because getting it wrong in space means dealing with floating waste, and that's a scenario nobody wants. Solid waste is compressed and stored in sealed containers that are eventually loaded onto cargo ships and burned up in the atmosphere. Urine is collected through a hose with different attachments for men and women, and here's where it gets interesting. That urine is recycled, filtered, purified, and turned back into drinking water. Yes, astronauts drink their own urine, or rather, they drink water that was once urine, now cleaned to higher purity standards than most tap water on Earth. The joke among astronauts is that today's coffee is tomorrow's coffee, and it's not entirely wrong. Fact 22. Showering is impossible on the International Space Station, and personal hygiene becomes an exercise in making do with limited resources. Earlier space stations like Skylab had shower facilities, awkward plastic enclosures where you sprayed yourself with water and then vacuumed up the floating droplets. But the ISS doesn't have room or resources for that. Instead, astronauts use wet wipes and rinseless shampoo. They dampen a towel with warm water from a pouch, add a little soap, and carefully clean themselves, section by section, making sure water droplets don't escape and float away. It's time-consuming, unsatisfying, nothing like the luxury of standing under running water. Hair washing is done with shampoo that doesn't need rinsing, rubbed into the scalp and then toweled dry, but it never feels truly clean. And after a few weeks, everyone on the station starts to smell. There's no hiding it, no escaping it. The recycled air carries everyone's body odor, a mix of sweat, skin, breath, all the scents that on Earth would be washed away or dispersed, but in space accumulate. Astronauts become accustomed to it, nose blind to their own smell and tolerant of others. But video calls with family sometimes bring comments about how they look tired. Worn, a polite way of saying they don't look fresh. Fact 23. Laundry is also impossible because there's no washing machine, no water to spare for cleaning clothes, no way to dry them in microgravity where evaporation happens differently. So astronauts wear the same clothes for days, sometimes weeks, depending on the item. Underwear gets changed every few days, a new pair from the supply closet, exercise clothes less often, worn through multiple workout sessions because there's no point in using up limited supplies, when everything's going to smell anyway. Regular clothes, shirts and pants, might be worn for a week or more. And when clothes become too dirty or worn, too saturated with sweat and body oil, they're not washed. They're thrown away, packed into Progress, cargo ships, or Cygnus vehicles, along with other trash. And when those ships detach from the station, they're deliberately crashed into the atmosphere where everything burns up. The clothing, the trash, all of it vaporizes, creating brief streaks of light as it re-enters. It's the most expensive laundry service imaginable, and the most final. Those clothes will never be clean because they'll never exist again. Fact 24. Exercise is mandatory on the space station, not a suggestion but a requirement. And astronauts must work out at least 2 hours every day to slow the inevitable loss of bone and muscle mass. They use a treadmill, but running in microgravity isn't like running on Earth. You have to strap yourself down with bungee, cords attached to a harness, pulling you toward the treadmill surface, creating an artificial version of gravity. The resistance is adjustable, simulating different body weights, but it's not the same. The impact is less, the mechanics are off, and the bungee cords chafe, leaving bruises on hips and shoulders. They use a resistance machine called AIRD, Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, that simulates weightlifting using pistons and flywheels. You can do squats, deadlifts, bench presses, exercises that load the bones and muscles in ways that approximate Earth conditions. And they use a stationary bike, pedaling against resistance, a monotonous but necessary routine. But even with all this, even with 2 hours of dedicated exercise every day, astronauts still lose muscle mass at a rate of about 1 to 2% per week. They still lose bone density, cardiovascular fitness. They still return weaker than they left, their bodies having adapted to an environment where strength isn't necessary, where moving takes almost no effort. The exercise buys them some protection, but it's not enough. Nothing they can do in those 2 hours fully compensates for living in microgravity the other 22 hours a day. Fact 25. Spacewalks, officially called extravehicular activities or EVA, are some of the most dangerous activities humans regularly perform. And astronauts who've done them describe the experience as both terrifying and transcendent. You're outside the station, in vacuum, with nothing but a spacesuit between you and death. The suit is essentially a small spacecraft, a self-contained environment that maintains pressure equivalent to about 5 pounds per square inch, provides oxygen, removes carbon dioxide, regulates temperature, protects from radiation and micrometeoroid impacts, and it's bulky, restrictive, difficult to move in. The gloves are rigid, pressurized, and working your hands inside them requires constant grip strength. After a 6 or 7 hour spacewalk, astronauts' hands are exhausted, cramping, sometimes bleeding from where the gloves have rubbed. Your fingers can lose nails from the pressure and friction, the nail bed bruising and the nail eventually detaching. It happens often enough that some astronauts don't bother treating it anymore, just waiting for the nail to fall off and grow back. And if something goes wrong during a spacewalk, if your suit tears, if a micrometeoroid punctures the fabric, if your oxygen system fails, you have minutes at most. There's no rescue vehicle, no way to get you inside quickly. You're out there alone in the most hostile environment imaginable, and survival depends entirely on your suit functioning perfectly. Fact 26. During the spacewalk, you're tethered to the station with safety cables, redundant connections that clip onto your suit and lock into rails along the station's exterior. But those tethers have failed before. In 2006, during a Russian spacewalk, cosmonaut Michael Turin's safety tether broke while he was working on the outside of the station. The metal clasp simply snapped, and suddenly he was connected by only his backup tether. Fortunately, he was holding onto the station with his hands, his grip the only thing preventing him from floating away while he reconnected. But the fear is real and well-founded. If you drift away, if both tethers fail, or you make a mistake and unclip yourself without maintaining a grip, there's no rescue. You float away, slowly at first, then faster as your orbital velocity carries you in a slightly different trajectory than the station. You can't swim through vacuum. You can't push off anything. There's no friction, no way to change course. You just drift helplessly, unable to do anything but watch the station recede. You have maybe 6 hours of oxygen in your suit, longer if you remain calm and breathe slowly, but even that's generous. More likely, you have less because you've already been working, using oxygen, building up carbon dioxide, and then you die alone, floating in the most profound isolation imaginable, watching Earth turn beneath you. Fact 27. The spacesuits themselves are aging, and this is becoming a serious problem for NASA and its partners. The suits currently used for spacewalks, the extravehicular mobility units, or EMUs, were designed in the 1970s. They've been refurbished, components replaced, systems updated, but they're essentially the same design, the same basic architecture developed half a century ago. And there aren't many left in service. NASA has fewer than a dozen functional suits at any given time, and each one has a limited lifespan. Parts wear out, seals degrade, and some components are no longer manufactured. Finding replacements means scrapping other suits for parts, a cannibalization process that reduces the total number available. Some astronauts have had to cancel or delay spacewalks because suits weren't available or weren't safe to use. And sizing is an issue too. The suits come in sections that can be assembled to fit different body types, but the range is limited. Some astronauts, particularly those who are very tall, very short, or unusually proportioned, may not have suits that fit properly, and an ill-fitting suit is dangerous. It restricts movement, creates pressure points, makes everything harder. NASA is developing new suits, next-generation designs meant to be more flexible, more adjustable, easier to maintain, but development is slow and underfunded. For now, astronauts continue using suits that are older than some of the crew members wearing them. Fact 28. Temperature extremes in space are intense, and managing them is one of the primary functions of a spacesuit. On the side of the station facing the sun, exposed to unfiltered solar radiation, temperatures can reach 250 degrees Fahrenheit or more. On the shadowed side, shielded from the sun, temperatures plunge to minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a 500-degree swing, depending on whether you're in sunlight or shadow. Your spacesuit has to protect you from both, often simultaneously as you move from light to dark during the course of a spacewalk. The suit's thermal regulation system uses circulating water, pumped through tubes woven into an undergarment that covers your body. This water carries heat away from your skin when you're working hard or in sunlight, and provides warmth when you're in shadow. The system works constantly, adjusting flow rates, balancing temperatures, trying to keep your body comfortable in an environment that's trying to simultaneously freeze and cook you. And sometimes it fails. Not catastrophically, but enough to cause discomfort. Astronauts have reported fingers going numb with cold or sweating profusely when the cooling can't keep up with their exertion. Managing your body temperature during a spacewalk, pacing your work to avoid overheating, positioning yourself to maximize or minimize sun exposure becomes a constant awareness. Fact 29. Tools float away during spacewalks with frustrating regularity, and each lost tool becomes another piece of space debris orbiting Earth. A wrench slips from gloved hands, the grip compromised by the thick material and limited dexterity. A bag of equipment comes untethered, the clip failing or accidentally released, and it just floats away, moving at the same orbital velocity as the station, roughly 17,500 miles per hour. From the astronaut's perspective, it seems to drift slowly, almost gently, but relative to Earth, it's screaming through space fast enough to circle the planet in 90 minutes. Some of this debris has been tracked, catalogued, given designations by organizations that monitor objects in orbit. A tool bag lost by astronaut Heidemarie Stephanischen Piper in 2008 was tracked for months as it gradually descended and eventually burned up in the atmosphere. But smaller items, bolts, washers, fragments of thermal blanket, these aren't trackable. They're too small for radar, invisible to tracking systems, but still dangerous. At orbital speeds, even a paint chip can punch through metal. Every lost tool is a potential hazard to spacecraft, a tiny projectile that could strike the station, a satellite, or another spacecraft. And astronauts are acutely aware of this, training extensively in tool retention, using tethers, working methodically, but accidents still happen. Fact 30. Speaking of debris, space is full of it, and the problem is getting worse. Millions of pieces of junk orbit Earth, ranging from dead satellites the size of buses to fragments smaller than a marble. Old rocket stages that have been in orbit since the 1960s, defunct satellites that have stopped responding to commands, fragments from collisions because in 2009 an American satellite and a Russian satellite collided, creating thousands of new debris pieces, fragments from anti-satellite weapon tests, because several countries have demonstrated the ability to destroy satellites in orbit, each test creating clouds of high-speed shrapnel. Most of this debris is small, but at orbital speeds, size doesn't matter much for destructive potential. A fleck of paint traveling at thousands of miles per hour carries enough kinetic energy to crack a window. The International Space Station has been hit many times, dozens of impacts, perhaps hundreds. The windows are regularly inspected and sometimes replaced because of micrometeoroid and debris impacts. There are chips, cracks, pits in the glass, and astronauts live with the knowledge that at any moment something could hit the station. Something too small to track, too fast to avoid, punching through a module and causing rapid It hasn't happened yet, not catastrophically, but the risk is real and increasing as more debris accumulates in orbit. Let's shift now to talk about the human body's strange responses to the space environment, the ways that biology rebels against conditions it was never designed for. Fact 31. Your face swells in space, and this fluid shift is one of the most immediately noticeable changes to your body. Without gravity pulling blood and fluids downward, they redistribute, shifting toward the upper body. Your face becomes puffy, swollen, like you've been crying or have a bad allergic reaction. Your sinuses clog with fluid that has nowhere to drain. Your eyes get bloodshot, the vessels dilated and prominent. You look permanently congested, like you have a bad cold that never goes away. And this isn't just cosmetic, isn't just about appearance. The fluid shift puts pressure on the optic nerve, the bundle of nerve fibers that connects your eye to your brain. Over weeks and months, this pressure can cause changes in vision. Many astronauts return with their eyesight altered, some becoming more far-sighted, struggling to read or see close objects. Some develop a flattening of the eyeball, a change in the shape of the eye itself. It's called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome, or SANS, and we don't fully understand it. The mechanism isn't completely clear. The long-term implications aren't known, and there's no reliable prevention. Some astronauts experience mild changes that resolve after returning to Earth. Others have permanent impairment, their vision never quite recovering to pre-flight levels. For missions to Mars, where astronauts would spend years in space, this is a serious concern. If your vision degrades significantly during the journey, you might not be able to perform critical tasks, and there's no optometrist on Mars. No way to get new glasses or treatment. Fact 32. Tears don't fall in space, and crying becomes a strange, uncomfortable experience. If you cry, and some astronauts do, overcome by homesickness or stress, or just the overwhelming strangeness of it all, the tears don't roll down your cheeks. They can't. There's no gravity to pull them downward. Instead, they just pool around. Your eyes, forming liquid spheres that cling to your face through surface tension. They sting, these accumulating tears, blurring your vision, but they don't fall away. You have to wipe them away manually, using a tissue or towel to absorb them. And even that's awkward because you have to be careful not to send droplets floating through the cabin. Some astronauts describe crying in space as frustrating, the tears refusing to cooperate, refusing to flow the way they should. It's one more reminder that even your body's most basic emotional responses assume gravity, that evolution designed every system around the expectation of weight, of up and down, and when those expectations aren't met, even something as human as tears becomes alien. Fact 33. Your immune system weakens in space, and this increased vulnerability to disease is one of the less visible but more serious health challenges. The stress of spaceflight, the physical demands, the psychological pressure, the disrupted sleep, all of it suppresses immune function. Your body produces fewer white blood cells. The cells you do have don't function as effectively, and dormant. Viruses, things you've carried for years without symptoms, can reactivate. Astronauts have developed shingles in orbit. The varicella zoster virus that causes chickenpox reactivating, causing painful rashes and nerve pain. Herpes simplex flares up, cold sores appearing that hadn't been a problem in years, and because you're living in close quarters with other people, in a confined space with recycled air, if one person gets sick, everyone gets sick. A cold passes through the crew, a stomach bug becomes a shared misery. The station has a medical kit, antibiotics and other medications, but options are limited. If something serious happens, if someone develops a severe infection or pneumonia, The only real option is evacuation, sending them home on the next available Soyuz, ending their mission early. And evacuation itself is risky, subjecting an already sick person to the stresses of re-entry and landing. Fact 34. Wounds heal more slowly in space, and this delayed healing has implications for any kind of injury or medical procedure. The lack of gravity affects cell division, the process by which your body generates new tissue to repair damage. Cells don't orient properly, don't communicate as effectively, don't migrate to wound sites as efficiently. A cut that would heal in a few days on Earth takes a week or more in orbit. And infections are more dangerous because they can establish themselves before the immune system mounts an effective response. There have been no major injuries on the ISS, no broken bones or deep cuts requiring surgery, but astronauts and ground control worry about what would happen if someone did get seriously hurt. If appendicitis developed, if someone had a severe accident, if emergency surgery became necessary, the options are extremely limited. There's basic medical training. Every crew has someone with empty-level skills, but performing complex procedures in microgravity with limited equipment would be incredibly difficult. Blood doesn't pool in wounds, it floats. Keeping the surgical site clean and preventing contamination would be nearly impossible, and the patient's body, already stressed from spaceflight, would be trying to heal under the worst possible conditions. For missions to Mars or other long-duration deep space flights, this is one of the major unsolved problems. How do you handle a medical emergency when the nearest hospital is months away? Fact 35. Radiation exposure is a constant concern in space, and it's one of the risks that can't be fully mitigated with current technology. Earth's magnetic field, the magnetosphere, protects us from much of the sun's radiation and from cosmic rays coming from deeper space. It deflects these charged particles, creating the radiation belts and auroras, but keeping the surface relatively safe. In low Earth orbit, where the ISS travels, that protection is reduced but still present. The station orbits within the magnetosphere, so astronauts are somewhat shielded, but they still receive significantly higher radiation doses than people on the ground. Over a 6-month mission, an astronaut receives as much radiation as you'd get from multiple full-body CT scans, roughly 50 to 200 millisieverts depending on solar activity and orbit, and that increases cancer risk. How much is still being studied, but estimates suggest a few percentage points increase in lifetime cancer risk per mission. For a single mission, that might be acceptable. For multiple long-duration missions, the cumulative dose becomes concerning. Fact 36. During solar storms, when the sun releases massive bursts of radiation in events called solar particle events or coronal mass ejections, radiation levels spike dramatically. These storms are unpredictable, though they're more common during the solar maximum, the peak of the sun's 11-year activity cycle. When a major solar event occurs, astronauts have to retreat to more shielded parts of the station, areas with extra protection from equipment racks, water supplies, anything that can absorb or deflect radiation, and they wait it out, sometimes for hours, monitoring radiation levels, hoping the storm passes before doses reach dangerous levels. For astronauts on the ISS, these events are survivable, concerning but manageable. But for astronauts traveling beyond Earth's magnetosphere to the Moon or Mars, solar storms become an existential threat. Without the magnetosphere's protection, a major solar event could deliver a lethal dose of radiation to crew members in transit. Current spacecraft don't have enough shielding to fully protect against this. Adding more shielding means more mass, which means more fuel, which means higher costs. It's an engineering problem with no easy solution, and until it's solved, deep space travel remains extremely risky during solar maximum periods. Fact 37. Your sense of balance is permanently altered after long-duration spaceflight. And this vestibular dysfunction can persist for months or even years after returning to Earth. Your inner ear, the organ responsible for detecting motion and orientation, essentially stops working the way it normally does. The semicircular canals, filled with fluid and tiny hair cells that sense movement, no longer receive clear signals because there's no consistent gravitational reference. Your brain learns to ignore vestibular input and rely more heavily on visual cues. And when you return to Earth, when gravity suddenly matters again, your brain has to relearn how to integrate all these signals. Even after months of recovery, even after the worst symptoms of nausea and dizziness have passed, some astronauts report feeling like the ground is tilting slightly, like the world isn't quite stable. They stumble more easily. Their sense of where their body is in space is slightly off. Their spatial awareness degraded. Some astronauts say they never fully return to their pre-flight balance, that there's a subtle but permanent change in how they perceive motion and orientation. Fact 38. Astronauts can't pour drinks normally when they first return to Earth, and watching them try is a fascinating glimpse into how deeply spaceflight rewires muscle memory. They'll start to pour a drink, tilting a container, and then release it mid-pour, expecting it to float. And it falls, splashing, making a mess, as gravity reasserts itself. They'll push off from chairs expecting to drift across the room, and instead they just launch themselves awkwardly, stumbling. They'll drop objects, releasing them at chest height, because in space that's a convenient place to leave something while you work on something else. On Earth, those objects crash to the floor. These aren't conscious mistakes. The astronauts know intellectually that gravity exists, but the motor patterns, the automatic movements that don't require thought, those have been reprogrammed for much, and it takes time for the brain to rebuild Earth-based instincts. Weeks of constantly reminding yourself that things fall, that you can't float, that the cup needs to be set down, not released. Relearning Earth, in some ways, is harder than learning to function in space, because Earth feels like it should be natural, familiar, but your body has forgotten how to move here. Fact 39. The psychological challenge of isolation is significant, and managing interpersonal relationships becomes critical to mission success. You're living in a small space with the same few people for months. The ISS isn't tiny. It's about as large as a 6-bedroom house in terms of pressurized volume, but most of that space is filled with equipment. The actual living area is much smaller, and there's no privacy, no personal space, no way to get away from each other. Every annoyance becomes magnified under these conditions. The way someone chews their food, a subtle sound you might not even notice in normal circumstances, becomes grating after weeks of hearing it at every meal. The tone of voice someone uses, a minor quirk in how they speak, starts to feel like nails on a chalkboard. Their habits, their quirks, the space they occupy, all of it can become a source of frustration. and there's nowhere to go, no way to take a walk and clear your head, no chance to spend an evening alone. Conflicts happen. Most astronauts are trained extensively in conflict resolution, in communication techniques, in how to address issues before they escalate. But the pressure builds anyway, and sometimes it breaks through. There have been incidents of crew members refusing to speak to each other, of arguments over minor issues becoming major problems, of interpersonal tension affecting mission operations. And ground control monitors these dynamics constantly, watching for signs of trouble, intervening when necessary, trying to keep the social ecosystem stable. Fact 40. Some astronauts report feeling disconnected from Earth during long missions, a psychological phenomenon that mission planners worry about. They're orbiting the planet, seeing it constantly, passing over familiar landmarks, watching their home countries slide by below. But they can't touch it. They can't feel wind or rain. They can't smell grass or taste fresh food, real food that hasn't been freeze-dried or They talk to loved ones through video calls, but the connection is mediated, pixelated, sometimes delayed. They watch life happen somewhere else, birthdays and holidays and daily routines, but they're not participating, just observing. And slowly, some astronauts say Earth starts to feel distant. Not physically, obviously it's right there, but emotionally, like they're watching life happen on a screen and they're no longer part of it. Some astronauts cope by maintaining strong connections, scheduling regular calls with family, sharing experiences through social media. Others withdraw somewhat, focusing on the work, on the immediate environment, accepting the disconnection as temporary. But the feeling is common enough that psychological support includes strategies for maintaining emotional connections across the physical divide. But let's talk about something stranger now. The moments when things go wrong, when the thin margin between safety and catastrophe becomes visible. Fact 41. Every astronaut who has spent time in space has experienced at least one moment of genuine fear, a sudden alarm or malfunction that reminds them how quickly everything could end. A fire alarm goes off and your heart rate spikes before you even consciously process what's happening. A pressure warning appears on a screen and you're moving, checking seals, looking for the leak before you've decided to move. A system failure occurs and you're running through emergency procedures you've practiced hundreds of times, but now it's real. Now it matters. And in those moments, astronauts are reminded that space doesn't care about bravery or training or experience. It's indifferent, hostile in its indifference. And survival depends on preparation, on redundancy, on the skill of people on the ground who are analyzing data and suggesting solutions, and on luck, always on luck. Because sometimes the difference between disaster and a close call is a single bolt that held when it might have failed, a seal that lasted one more day, a trajectory that missed instead of hit. Fact 42. In 1997, a Progress supply ship collided with the Mir space station, and the crew came within minutes of abandoning the station entirely. The Progress was being maneuvered manually in a docking test, an attempt to save money by not using the automated system. But the test went wrong. The cargo ship approached too fast at the wrong angle and struck the Spectre module, puncturing the hull. The station began losing pressure, air hissing through the hole into vacuum. The crew had minutes, perhaps only 2 or 3, to seal off the damaged module before the entire station depressurized. They moved frantically, pulling cables through the hatch, connecting Spectre to the rest of the station. Trying to close the hatch, but unable to because cables were in the way. Eventually, they just cut the cables, sacrificing whatever equipment was connected, and slammed the hatch shut, sealing off Spectre. The pressure loss stopped, but the station was crippled. Spectre had contained solar panels that provided power, scientific equipment, personal items. All of it was now inaccessible, locked in a damaged module open to space. The crew spent the next weeks living in a smaller, more crowded station while ground control planned repairs. Eventually, they were able to install a patch and repressurize Spectre, but the incident highlighted how quickly things could go wrong, how close they'd come to losing everything. Fact 43. In 2013, during a spacewalk outside the ISS, Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano's helmet started filling with water and he nearly drowned in space. It began as a small amount of water at the back of his helmet, moisture he initially thought was from his drink bag. But it increased, spreading over his head, covering his ears, pooling around his face. He couldn't see clearly. He couldn't hear properly through the water, communication with ground control becoming garbled, and he couldn't remove the helmet because he was in vacuum outside the station. If he'd opened his helmet, he would have died instantly. The water continued to accumulate, covering his eyes, rising toward his nose and mouth, and Parmitano realized he might drown. In space, inside his spacesuit, he began making his way back to the airlock, moving carefully but quickly, essentially blind, relying on touch and memory to navigate along the station's exterior. He made it inside, and crew members helped him remove the helmet as soon as the airlock He emerged, soaked, coughing, but alive. The cause was eventually traced to a clogged filter in the suit's water cooling system, causing water to leak into the ventilation system and then into the helmet. It was a design flaw no one had anticipated, and it nearly killed him. After this incident, spacewalks were suspended while engineers redesigned parts of the suit to prevent similar malfunctions. Fact 44. Fires have occurred in space, and they're one of the most terrifying emergencies a crew can face. In 1997, a fire broke out on Mir when an oxygen generator malfunctioned. These generators use a chemical process, passing electrical current through a solid material to produce oxygen, and one of them overheated and caught fire. Flames erupted, and in the confined space of the station, smoke filled the modules within seconds. The crew couldn't evacuate because there was nowhere to go. They couldn't open windows or doors to vent the smoke. They fought the fire with extinguishers while wearing gas masks, trying to see through the thick smoke, trying to breathe through the masks while their hearts pounded and adrenaline flooded their systems. They managed to put the fire out, the flames extinguishing when the oxygen generator was disabled and the immediate fuel was consumed. But the smoke didn't dissipate, not quickly. In microgravity, smoke doesn't rise. It hangs in the air, a thick haze that coats surfaces, infiltrates lungs, stings eyes. The ventilation system slowly cleared it, but the process took hours, and the smell lingered for weeks. Everything on the station absorbed the odor, clothing, equipment, surfaces, and the crew was left dealing with the psychological aftermath. the awareness that they'd come close to dying, that fire in space is especially dangerous because there's no escape. Fact 45. Ammonia leaks are among the most dangerous malfunctions on the ISS. BECA-USE ammonia is the coolant used in the station's thermal regulation system, and it's highly toxic. The station uses ammonia to carry heat away from internal systems to external radiators, where it's released into space. But if a leak develops, if ammonia gets into the habitable modules, astronauts have to evacuate immediately. The gas is poisonous, causing respiratory damage, chemical burns, death with sufficient exposure. These leaks have happened. In 2015, an alarm indicated a possible ammonia leak inside the US segment of the station. The crew had to quickly don gas masks and retreat to the Russian segment, sealing hatches behind them while ground control analyzed the situation. They prepared to evacuate to the Soyuz capsules if necessary, ready to abandon the station entirely if the leak couldn't be contained. After several tense hours, engineers determined the alarm was a false positive, triggered by a faulty sensor rather than an actual leak. But the crew had to wait, sealed in the Russian modules, breathing through masks until ground control was certain. And the experience reinforced how quickly a normal day could turn into an emergency, how close they always are to evacuation or worse. Fact 46. In 2015, a different ammonia incident required an emergency spacewalk to fix a leak in the station's cooling system. Astronauts detected ammonia crystals venting from one of the cooling loops, visible as white flakes against the black of space. Something had failed, and coolant was escaping. Two astronauts, Terry Virts and Barry Wilmore, had to perform an unplanned spacewalk to replace the failed component. The repair was successful. The leak stopped, but it was risky. Ammonia is dangerous even in vacuum, even in the trace amounts that might contact their suits. If they'd brought contamination back inside, if ammonia had gotten onto their suits and then off-gassed in the airlock, it could have poisoned the entire crew. So they followed careful decontamination procedures, baking their suits in sunlight to evaporate any ammonia residue, waiting for hours before and the repair itself was delicate, working with cold, brittle materials, wearing thick gloves, trying to connect lines without causing further damage. But they succeeded, and the station's cooling system was restored. It was another reminder that the ISS is a machine, a complex system that requires constant maintenance, and any failure could cascade into something catastrophic. Fact 47. Returning to Earth is violent in a way that surprises even astronauts who intellectually understand the forces involved. The Soyuz capsule, which brings astronauts home from the ISS, experiences forces up to 4 or 5 times Earth's gravity during re-entry. You're pressed back into your seat, unable to move, barely able to breathe. Your vision narrows as blood pulls away from your brain. Some astronauts black out entirely, losing consciousness for seconds or minutes. The capsule heats to over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. On the outside, as friction with the atmosphere converts orbital velocity into thermal energy. Inside, you're insulated, protected by heat shields, but you can feel the heat radiating through the walls. You're falling, plummeting through the atmosphere at thousands of miles per hour, and the deceleration is brutal. The parachutes deploy, but even that's violent, a sudden jerk that snaps you against the straps. And the landing, when the capsule hits the ground, is hard. very hard. The Soyuz lands on solid ground in the steppes of Kazakhstan, and there's limited shock absorption. Astronauts describe it as like being in a car crash, a bone-jarring impact that leaves you stunned. And then, if everything has gone right, the hatch opens and you smell fresh air for the first time in months, and recovery crews help you out and you're home. But the violence of the journey stays with you. Fact 48. Parachute failures and other malfunctions during launch or landing have occurred, and they remind everyone involved that spaceflight will never be routine. In 2018, a Soyuz launch failed shortly after liftoff when one of the rocket's boosters didn't separate properly. The booster struck the core stage, damaging it, and the rocket began tumbling. The crew capsule automatically separated, firing its escape rockets, pulling away from the failing rocket. The capsule arced through the air, reached a peak altitude, and then plummeted back toward Earth, parachutes deploying, bringing the crew down in a ballistic trajectory that subjected them to over 6 times normal gravity. They landed hard in the Kazakhstan desert, the capsule slamming into the ground with enough force to injure less conditioned passengers. But the astronaut and cosmonaut inside, Nick Hague and Alexei Ovchinin, were trained for this, had practiced until the motions were automatic. They were bruised, shaken, but alive. It was the first manned launch failure in decades, since Soyuz T-10-1 in 1983, when a launch pad fire forced an emergency abort, and it highlighted that even with all the safety systems, all the redundancy, all the testing, launches remain dangerous. Every launch is a controlled explosion, and sometimes that control slips. Fact 49. The Challenger disaster in 1986 killed all 7 crew members, and the incident fundamentally changed how NASA approached risk. A cold morning in Florida, temperatures below freezing, and engineers warning that the O-rings sealing the solid rocket boosters might not function properly in the cold. But the launch proceeded anyway. Pressure to maintain schedule, to demonstrate that spaceflight was routine. 73 seconds after launch, one of the O-rings failed. Hot gas escaped, blowtorched through the external fuel tank, and the tank ruptured. The shuttle broke apart, torn by aerodynamic forces it was never designed to withstand. The crew cabin remained intact initially, and evidence suggests some crew members survived the breakup, activating emergency oxygen supplies conscious during the fall. But the cabin hit the ocean at over 200 miles per hour, and no one survives that. NASA recovered the bodies, retrieved debris, conducted investigations. The cause was clear: organizational failures, pressure to launch, ignoring engineering concerns. And the Space Shuttle program was grounded for years, while safety systems were redesigned. But 7 people were dead, 7 experienced astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher who was supposed to inspire students about space. And millions watched it happen live on television, in classrooms, the plume of smoke diverging as the shuttle disintegrated. Fact 50. Space radiation doesn't just damage cells superficially. It penetrates deeply, altering DNA and increasing the likelihood of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and even neurological degeneration. Unlike on Earth, where our atmosphere and magnetosphere deflect most harmful particles, astronauts in low Earth orbit or traveling to the Moon or Mars are exposed to galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events that can pass through the body. breaking molecular bonds. Shielding can reduce exposure, but never eliminate it entirely. Every spacecraft has limitations based on weight, cost, and design constraints. Prolonged exposure can lead to cognitive decline, memory loss, or difficulty with motor coordination. Changes that may not appear until months or years after returning to Earth. Some experiments on rodents have shown permanent behavioral changes after exposure to comparable radiation levels, raising questions about the long-term neurological impacts for human crews. Even simple daily tasks could become impaired over time, and the lack of immediate treatment options in deep space makes prevention and careful monitoring essential. Radiation is invisible, silent, and unforgiving, a constant reminder that the vacuum of space is fundamentally hostile to life as we know it. Fact 51. Your sense of taste changes more dramatically than you might expect in space. And it isn't just a matter of muted flavors. The fluid shifts toward your head, swelling your nasal passages, diminishing your ability to detect subtle tastes and aromas. Astronauts report craving spicier, saltier, and more pungent foods than they ever would on Earth. But the problem isn't solved by simply adding more seasoning. Microgravity alters the movement of liquids in your mouth, changing the way food interacts with your taste buds. Sauces cling differently, juices don't coat the tongue in the same way, and even chewing requires a conscious effort to keep food in place. Over weeks and months, astronauts describe meals becoming less enjoyable, reduced to fuel rather than pleasure, with texture as important as flavor, because the sensation of chewing anchors them to a semblance of normalcy. Some adapt by inventing rituals, carefully rolling tortillas to prevent crumbs from floating away, sipping liquids in precise doses, or using utensils like tongs to control every bite. Eating becomes an exercise in mindfulness, attention, and precision. Yet the constant monotony of recycled or rehydrated foods inevitably weighs on morale, highlighting how even something as basic as a meal is transformed by the demands of microge vity. Fact 52. The vestibular system, responsible for balance and spatial orientation, is profoundly disrupted in space, and its recovery on Earth can be unexpectedly prolonged. In microgravity, the semicircular canals in your inner ear no longer detect acceleration in the usual way. Your brain adapts by relying more heavily on visual and tactile cues, but that rewiring isn't perfect. When returning to Earth, gravity suddenly reasserts itself, and simple acts like walking, bending, or climbing stairs become disorienting. Astronauts describe feeling like the world is tilting or shifting beneath them, stumbling even on flat surfaces, overcorrecting with every step. Some report lingering effects for months, like vertigo or a sense of subtle imbalance. And research suggests that repeated, long-duration missions may compound these effects, gradually altering your sense of equilibrium permanently. Vestibular dysfunction also interacts with psychological stress. The disorientation can provoke anxiety, irritability, and sleep disturbances, creating a cycle of discomfort that persists long after the mission ends. This persistent recalibration underscores how deeply our bodies are designed for Earth's gravity and how fragile that equilibrium becomes when removed from its natural environment. Fact 53. alters fluid distribution in ways that affect cardiovascular function in surprising ways. Blood shifts toward the upper body, increasing pressure in the head, neck, and chest, which can cause facial puffiness, nasal congestion, and even eye complications. The heart adapts by becoming more spherical and less efficient at pumping blood against gravity, a change that may persist after returning to Earth. Lower body veins shrink from disuse, sometimes leading to dizziness or fainting during readaptation. Beyond the mechanical stress, these shifts influence hormone regulation, fluid retention, and even kidney function, as the body tries to balance salt and water without the familiar cues of gravity. Over time, plasma volume decreases, meaning the total amount of circulating blood is lower than on Earth, creating subtle but significant changes to endurance, exercise capacity, and tolerance for heat or stress. For astronauts on long missions, these adaptations create a delicate juggling act, maintaining cardiovascular health, avoiding clotting disorders, and ensuring that their circulatory system can respond effectively during emergencies, IVAs, or sudden exertion. The body, so perfectly tuned for Earth, becomes a fragile system in space, and its adjustments are both remarkable and precarious. Fact 54. Prolonged isolation and confinement have profound psychological effects, compounded by distance from Earth and loved ones. The International Space Station may have the pressurized volume of a 6-bedroom house, but half of it is equipment, leaving a cramped living space with no privacy. Over months, small annoyances magnify. A crewmate's voice tone, a repetitive noise, or the smell of recycled air becomes a source of tension. Even highly trained astronauts experience irritability, disrupted sleep, or feelings of loneliness and detachment from the outside world. Maintaining morale requires structured routines, scheduled communication with family, shared social activities, and mutual support. Mission planners emphasize resilience, emotional intelligence, and conflict resolution. But unexpected incidents like disagreements over tasks or miscommunications with mission control can escalate quickly. Psychological support is continuous, with specialists monitoring interactions, analyzing stress levels, and intervening if necessary. Despite all preparation, the isolation is absolute. Earth is always visible through a window, yet entirely unreachable, emphasizing the emotional dissonance of observing life from afar while remaining completely separated from it. Fact 55. Sleep in space is disrupted by factors both subtle and extreme. The ISS orbits the Earth every 90 minutes, meaning astronauts experience 16 sunrises and sunsets each Earth day. Their circadian rhythms, honed over millions of years, struggle to adapt to the relentless artificial light and fluctuating shadows. Even with blackout masks, regulated lighting, and strict schedules, many astronauts report insomnia, fragmented sleep, or vivid dreams influenced by stress and sensory disorientation. The lack of gravity also means that the body no longer settles naturally in a comfortable position, requiring straps, harnesses, or sleeping bags anchored to a wall or ceiling. Ambient noise ventilation, fans, machinery hum, and communications creates constant, low-level disturbance. Sleep deprivation compounds every other stressor, cognitive performance declines, reaction times slow, and irritability increases, affecting both individual and crew functioning. Maintaining a consistent sleep schedule is not just a comfort but a necessity, critical for physical recovery, mental resilience, and the ability to respond rapidly to emergencies where every decision could be life or death. Fact 56 might accelerates bone and muscle loss at rates far beyond normal aging on Earth. Weight, bones, spine, hips, femurs lose density at approximately 1 to 2% per month, far faster than patients with osteoporosis on Earth. Muscles atrophy because resistance is no longer necessary. Arms, legs, and core weaken despite daily exercise routines. Resistance devices, treadmills with bungee harnesses, and stationary bikes slow the process, but cannot fully replicate Earth-like mechanical loading. Loss of skeletal mass increases fracture risk, especially for long-duration missions. And even with recovery on Earth, some bone density may never return. Muscle weakening similarly persists, affecting posture, balance, and coordination, requiring extended rehabilitation. This degradation isn't merely physical, it also influences cardiovascular performance, metabolism, and hormonal regulation. Every day in microgravity is a subtle rebellion against the body's natural design, and astronauts must fight constantly to maintain the systems that evolution built for Earth's gravity. Fact 57. Vision changes in space. Often called spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome (SANS), can be subtle at first but become profound over time. The fluid shift toward the head increases intracranial pressure, flattening the eyeball and sometimes thickening the optic nerve. Many astronauts report blurred vision, difficulty focusing on near objects, or temporary changes in depth perception. The problem isn't limited to eyesight. The brain itself adapts to altered sensory input, rewiring connections between vision, balance, and proprioception. Some changes persist long after returning to Earth, requiring corrective lenses, specialized therapy, or ongoing monitoring. The mechanisms are still under study, but MRI scans show that the brain's ventricles, fluid-filled cavities expand in microgravity, which may contribute to chronic headaches, visual distortion, or subtle cognitive shifts. This syndrome illustrates that space affects the body at multiple levels simultaneously: mechanical, neurological, and physiological, all interacting in ways that are still being unraveled, highlighting the delicacy of human adaptation to a fundamentally alien environment. Fact 58. The human immune system behaves unpredictably in microgravity, showing both suppression and hyperactivation in different contexts. White blood cell function can diminish, reducing the ability to fight infections, while latent viruses like herpes or Epstein-Barr sometimes reactivate in astronauts without symptoms. Vaccination responses may weaken, and wound healing slows, creating hidden vulnerabilities. Researchers have observed changes in cytokine signaling, shifts in gut microbiota, and altered inflammatory responses, all of which can amplify stress on other bodily systems. Exercise, diet, and sleep can mitigate some effects, but the interplay of microgravity, radiation, and isolation creates a complex, sometimes contradictory immune landscape. This unpredictability is especially concerning for deep space missions, where even minor infections could escalate rapidly in a closed environment. Astronauts must rely on prevention, meticulous hygiene, and careful medical monitoring, but the immune system's hidden instability underscores how microgravity subtly disrupts defenses that we normally take for granted. Fact 59. Microgravity profoundly changes how the body metabolizes nutrients and stores energy, with implications for both short and long-term health. Appetite may fluctuate unpredictably due to sensory changes, stress, and fluid shifts, while nutrient absorption and hormonal signaling may alter how calories and vitamins are processed. Muscle protein synthesis slows. Bone calcium is lost through urinary excretion, and fat distribution shifts often toward the upper body. These changes interact with other microgravity effects, such as cardiovascular adjustments, bone loss, and immune system variability, creating a web of physiological consequences. Astronauts must meticulously plan meals, balancing macronutrients, micronutrients, and hydration to compensate for these altered metabolic pathways. Even small imbalances can exacerbate muscle wasting, fatigue, or bone demineralization. Long-term missions magnify these concerns, and resupply from Earth is often limited, making nutritional planning a critical aspect of mission success. Food becomes more than sustenance. It is medicine, performance support, and a subtle psychological anchor, requiring constant attention to maintain equilibrium in a body that is subtly rebelling against its new environment. Fact 60. Microgravity profoundly alters the way wounds heal and the body repairs tissue. Studies show that skin, muscle, and connective tissue regenerate more slowly in space, while scar formation can increase or become irregular. Blood clotting may be affected, making small injuries potentially riskier than they appear, and inflammatory responses can shift unpredictably. Researchers have observed that fibroblasts, the cells responsible for repairing connective tissue, behave differently in zero gravity, sometimes losing directional migration or forming abnormal extracellular matrices. Combined with immune system variability, radiation exposure, and constrained medical resources, this creates a scenario where even minor cuts or abrasions require careful monitoring. Preventive measures, specialized bandages, and antiseptic protocols are essential. But space crews must also be trained to recognize subtle warning signs of infection or delayed healing. The body's natural ability to repair itself, taken for granted on Earth, is fundamentally challenged, emphasizing that every aspect of human biology is finely tuned to gravity, and its absence exposes vulnerabilities that were previously invisible. Fact 61. Prolonged exposure to microgravity disrupts the body's endocrine system, influencing hormones that regulate growth, stress, metabolism, and sleep. Cortisol levels often fluctuate, influenced by both physical and psychological stresses, while thyroid and insulin signaling may change subtly, affecting energy balance. Sex hormones can shift as well, altering reproductive function, bone metabolism, and cardiovascular responses. These changes are not always immediately apparent, but they interact with other microgravity effects: bone loss, muscle atrophy, immune modulation, and cardiovascular remodeling. The cumulative impact creates a cascade of subtle but significant health risks that must be carefully managed through monitoring, exercise, diet, and medication when necessary. Hormonal changes can also influence mood, cognitive performance, and sleep quality, making endocrine health a cornerstone of overall astronaut well-being. In many ways, the endocrine system acts as the body's internal thermostat, maintaining homeostasis, and in space, that balance is constantly challenged, requiring vigilance and adaptability on the part of both astronauts and mission. Planners. Fact 62. Microgravity profoundly changes the dynamics of bodily fluids beyond just blood or lymph, affecting the eyes, brain, and gastrointestinal system. Cerebrospinal fluid pressure increases subtly, potentially compressing delicate structures in the brain and spinal cord. The digestive system experiences slower transit times, altered gut microbiota, and subtle shifts in nutrient absorption. Urinary output and kidney function are affected, with calcium loss from bones increasing the risk of kidney stone formation. Even saliva and tears behave differently, pooling or floating in unpredictable ways. These fluid changes contribute to headaches, vision problems, and discomfort, but also intersect with immune, endocrine, and musculoskeletal adaptations, creating a complex network of interactions that can amplify health risks. Every system is interdependent, and a minor perturbation in one like fluid distribution ripples across multiple others, emphasizing that microgravity affects humans as a fully integrated organism rather than isolated organ systems. Understanding these interactions is critical for planning long-duration missions where small imbalances could escalate into serious medical emergencies. Fact 60. 3. Long-term spaceflight impacts mental resilience in ways that extend beyond immediate isolation or confinement. Cognitive performance may fluctuate subtly, influenced by disrupted sleep, sensory monotony, and microgravity-induced neurological changes. Problem-solving, memory recall, and decision-making can all experience subtle degradation over time, compounded by stress, fatigue, and interpersonal tension. Crew dynamics play a crucial role. Even minor disagreements can escalate when every interaction is magnified by proximity and monotony. Mission planners focus on psychological support, simulated stress training, and team-building exercises. But the unpredictability of human behavior means stress management remains an ongoing challenge. Emotional regulation, mindfulness practices, and structured social interaction become essential tools for sustaining mental health. Spaceflight, even for highly trained professionals, is as much a test of psychological endurance as physical adaptability, and success depends on integrating mental, emotional, and physiological strategies to maintain performance under extreme and sustained pressure. Fact 6. The effects of microgravity on the human cardiovascular system extend far beyond just the heart itself. Without gravity pulling blood downward, the body experiences a chronic headward fluid shift that increases pressure in the upper body and alters vascular function. Veins in the head and neck swell, contributing to facial puffiness and even headaches, while the heart itself adapts to pumping less against resistance, sometimes becoming more spherical and less efficient over time. Blood volume decreases as the body senses it is overfilled, and red blood cell production may decline in response. These changes can persist for weeks or months after return to Earth, leaving astronauts prone to orthostatic intolerance, dizziness, fainting, and lightheadedness when standing. The interaction between cardiac remodeling, blood volume regulation, and vascular elasticity highlights the fragility of the human cardiovascular system in environments for which it was never designed, and emphasizes the need for constant monitoring, exercise protocols, and careful reintegration into Earth's gravity. Fact 65. Microgravity affects the human brain in ways scientists are only beginning to understand, influencing both structure and function. Studies of astronauts using MRI scans have shown shifts in brain tissue, including slight upward movement within the skull due to fluid redistribution, changes in the cerebellum and motor cortex, and altered white matter connectivity. These structural shifts correlate with functional changes affecting balance, coordination, and spatial orientation. Cognitive functions, particularly those reliant on sensory integration and spatial reasoning, can be subtly altered. Long-term exposure may affect memory, attention, and reaction times, while adaptation to microgravity requires the brain to constantly recalibrate signals from vision, proprioception, and the vestibular system. These neural changes are partially reversible but can persist for months, highlighting that the brain itself is plastic, adaptable, but also vulnerable when placed in an environment far from the one in which it evolved. Understanding these changes is critical for designing spacecraft, mission schedules, and exercises that minimize cognitive risk during long-duration spaceflight. Fact 66. The musculoskeletal system experiences dramatic adaptation in microgravity, with muscles losing mass, strength, and endurance despite rigorous exercise regimens. Muscle atrophy is most pronounced in the lower body and spine, where muscles that normally counteract gravity experience minimal load. The quadriceps, calves, and back muscles are particularly vulnerable, weakening at rates of up to 1 to 2% per week. Tendons and ligaments, accustomed to stabilizing joints under load, also experience reduced tensile strength, increasing injury risk. Resistance training machines and treadmills on board the ISS provide partial mitigation, but no current technology can fully replicate the multi-directional forces experienced on Earth. Over time, these changes compound, affecting posture, gait, and overall functional capacity. Readaptation to Earth's gravity requires extensive rehabilitation and can take months, demonstrating how intimately human anatomy is connected to the constant presence of weight, and how the absence of gravity exposes systemic vulnerabilities that evolve slowly, invisibly, and sometimes permanently. Fact 6. The gastrointestinal system is subtly altered in space, with microgravity influencing digestion, motility, and microbiome balance. Food and fluids move differently without gravity, requiring conscious swallowing and careful management of hydration. Transit times through the digestive tract can change, and astronauts sometimes experience bloating, gas, or discomfort that would be mild on Earth but becomes pronounced in microgravity. The gut microbiota, a delicate ecosystem influenced by diet, stress, and environment, can shift in composition, affecting immune function, nutrient absorption, and even mental health through the gut-brain axis. These changes are compounded by the limited variety and altered texture of space food, restricted fresh produce, and reliance on freeze-dried, thermostabilized or rehydrated meals. Maintaining gastrointestinal health requires careful attention to diet, probiotics, and hydration, illustrating that even the most mundane bodily processes are transformed in subtle but profound ways when removed from Earth's gravitational environment. Fact 60. Microgravity transforms sensory perception in unexpected ways, particularly affecting proprioception and tactile feedback. Astronauts report that tasks requiring precise hand-eye coordination become more difficult even after extended adaptation. Objects float unpredictably, altering the way forces are applied and interpreted by muscles and joints. Simple actions, pouring a liquid, tightening a bolt, or grasping a tool require conscious recalibration of motor planning and feedback loops. Over time, the brain adapts, creating new neural pathways to anticipate object behavior in weightlessness. But these adaptations can interfere with movement upon return to Earth. Even vision interacts with these altered sensory cues. Depth perception shifts. Peripheral awareness is altered, and spatial orientation depends heavily on visual anchors. The integration of multiple sensory systems, vestibular, visual, proprioceptive, is continuously challenged in microgravity, demonstrating that human perception is finely tuned to gravity, and the absence of it demands constant cognitive and physical adaptation to maintain even basic competence. Fact 69. The psychological impact of long-duration missions cannot be overstated, as isolation, confinement, and distance from Earth create a unique stress environment. Even highly trained astronauts can experience fluctuations in mood, motivation, and mental resilience, sometimes leading to sleep disturbances, irritability, or subtle cognitive decline. Group dynamics are under constant scrutiny. Minor interpersonal conflicts can escalate in tight quarters, while reliance on a small crew magnifies the consequences of miscommunication or emotional tension. To counter these risks, mission planners implement structured schedules, private communication windows, recreational activities, and periodic psychological evaluations. Virtual reality simulations, mindfulness training, and structured physical activity provide outlets for stress management. Yet, despite these measures, the combination of physical strain, sensory monotony, and psychological stress requires extraordinary mental adaptability. Success depends not only on skill and training, but on sustained emotional resilience, highlighting that spaceflight is a test of the human spirit as much as the human body. Fact 70. The cumulative effects of space radiation represent one of the most persistent, least controllable risks to astronauts, particularly for missions beyond Earth's protective magnetosphere. Cosmic rays, solar particle events, and high-energy radiation permeate space, interacting with tissues and DNA in ways that can accelerate aging, increase cancer risk, and disrupt cellular function. Shielding within spacecraft mitigates, but cannot fully eliminate, exposure, and prolonged missions accumulate doses that exceed typical Earth-based occupational limits. Radiation also affects the central nervous system, potentially impairing cognitive function and mood regulation, and can exacerbate cardiovascular, musculoskeletal, and immune vulnerabilities. Countermeasures enhance shielding, pharmacological interventions, and optimized mission planning provide partial protection, but the risk remains fundamental to deep space exploration. Radiation exposure transforms every aspect of mission planning, influencing spacecraft design, scheduling, and crew selection, serving as a constant reminder that beyond Earth, humans operate in an environment where survival depends on both meticulous preparation and the limits of biology itself. Fact 71. The human body's adaptation to microgravity begins almost immediately, but so does its deterioration. Within hours of arrival, fluid redistribution causes facial puffiness and bird legs as lower body fluids migrate upward. The vestibular system becomes confused, producing space, motion sickness, dizziness, nausea, and disorientation that can last for days. Some astronauts vomit repeatedly, even while performing complex operations. The body gradually recalibrates, but the process is mentally exhausting. Once adapted, new challenges emerge. Muscles begin weakening, bones start losing density, and the heart remodels itself to pump differently. Every adaptation is a compromise, an equilibrium between survival and degradation. The human body is extraordinarily flexible, but it was never meant for this environment. Adaptation doesn't mean thriving. It means maintaining just enough balance to function, to survive, to return home without permanent damage. This constant physiological negotiation continues throughout the mission, a silent tug-of-war between evolution and invention, between biology and engineering. Fact 72. The psychological effect of seeing Earth from orbit, known as the overview effect, is one of the most profound emotional transformations astronauts describe. From space, borders disappear, politics evaporate, and the fragility of the planet becomes heartbreakingly clear. Many astronauts experience awe so intense it borders on the spiritual. They describe Earth as a living organism, a luminous sphere wrapped in a paper-thin atmosphere, floating alone in darkness. Some weep, others fall silent, overcome by perspective. This emotional experience often leads to deep reflection and, for some, lasting shifts in worldview. But it can also create cognitive dissonance, a sense of alienation from daily life upon return. Difficulty reconciling the vastness of that vision with the smallness of human concerns. The overview effect can be both inspiring and isolating, a permanent reminder that while spaceflight expands the mind, it also changes how astronauts see their own species, often leaving them with a quiet sadness about humanity's divisions back on the surface below. Fact 73. Spacewalks, or extravehicular activities, IVAs, are among the most dangerous tasks an astronaut can perform, despite appearing graceful and serene from the outside. Each EVA is a precisely choreographed operation involving pressurized suits, tethers, and redundant systems designed to protect against vacuum, temperature extremes, and micrometeoroids traveling faster than bullets. Yet, even with preparation, spacewalkers face hazards that can't be rehearsed. A minor tear, a detached tool, or a communication delay can escalate into a crisis. The suits themselves are rigid and fatiguing, requiring constant effort to move fingers and arms against internal pressure. After several hours, hands ache, fingertips go numb, and sweat pools inside the helmet. The beauty of Earth gliding silently below contrasts sharply with the reality of isolation and danger. Every breath, every motion, every heartbeat inside the suit is a reminder of how close the line between life and death truly is. a thin membrane of fabric and metal separating a human from the infinite vacuum beyond. Fact 74. The soundscape of the International Space Station is unlike any other environment humans have inhabited. It is never silent. Fans, pumps, computers, and life support systems produce a constant background hum, a blend of mechanical worry and rhythmic vibration. Silence would mean failure, the end of air circulation, cooling, or power. Over time, astronauts learn to identify specific tones and rhythms, recognizing normal operation by ear, like musicians detecting harmony. A change in sound, a new pitch, an unusual clicking can trigger instant alertness. Yet this continuous noise also contributes to fatigue, stress, and disrupted sleep. Earplugs help, but the awareness of machines keeping you alive never fades. When astronauts return to Earth, the absence of that mechanical heartbeat feels unsettling. They describe lying awake at night, disoriented by the silence, missing the steady reassurance of machinery that had become synonymous with safety. Fact 70. Smell in space is an underappreciated sensory phenomenon, and it leaves a lasting impression. Inside the station, the air is filtered and recycled constantly, but metallic and mechanical odors persist, a combination of hot electronics, ozone, and sealed plastics. When astronauts remove their helmets after a spacewalk, they often describe a distinct scent clinging to their suits: burnt metal, welding fumes, or the smell of spent gunpowder. Scientists believe this comes from atomic oxygen in the upper atmosphere reacting with materials on the suit's surface, producing volatile compounds. The human brain associates these sharp, industrial scents with danger, creating an instinctive sense of alertness. Smell becomes part of the sensory language of survival in orbit, a cue as important as sound or touch, an invisible reminder of where you are, not on Earth, but in a place where every breath is borrowed. Fact 7. Micrometeoroids, tiny fragments of rock and metal traveling at tens of thousands of miles per hour, are among the most unpredictable threats in space. Even a particle the size of a grain of sand carries enough kinetic energy to puncture metal or shatter glass. The ISS is protected by multi-layered shielding called Whipple bumpers, designed to vaporize small debris on impact, but no system is foolproof. Occasionally, astronauts find pockmarks or tiny craters on station windows or solar panels, visible scars from invisible collisions. Radar tracks larger debris, but countless fragments too small to monitor still orbit the planet. Remnants of past missions, collisions, or explosions. A micrometeoroid strike during a spacewalk or on a pressure module could be catastrophic, creating a breach in seconds. The possibility of sudden, untraceable impact is a constant. Silent danger, one that cannot be seen, heard, or avoided, only endured with trust in the engineering that stands between life and vacuum. Fact 70. Time itself feels different in space. The absence of natural day-night cycles and the relentless orbit, 16 sunrises and sunsets every 24 hours, disorients human perception of duration and rhythm. Astronauts live by coordinated universal time UTC, following tightly scripted schedules for work, meals, and sleep. Yet psychological time drifts. Days blur together. Weeks vanish unnoticed. Some describe time as stretching endlessly during isolation, while others feel it compress into a continuous stream of motion and routine. The boundaries between yesterday, today, and tomorrow dissolve. Long-duration missions amplify this effect, eroding the normal anchors of memory and anticipation. Upon return to Earth, resynchronizing with planetary time can be surprisingly difficult. Light, sound, and gravity feel different, and the clock that governs ordinary life seems strangely arbitrary. Time and space, like gravity, becomes an experience shaped not by physics alone, but by the mind's struggle to find meaning in a place where nothing is constant except change itself. Fact 7. Eating in space is both a necessity and a challenge that demands re-engineering one of humanity's most universal rituals. Every crumb, every droplet, every puff of powder can become a hazard in microgravity. Food is vacuum-sealed, thermostabilized, or freeze-dried, packaged in ways that prevent debris from floating into instruments or lungs. Meals are rehydrated with hot water, stirred with care, and eaten with spoons that cling magnetically to trays. Salt and pepper come in liquid form. Even with such measures, eating is more labor than leisure. Taste perception dulls due to fluid shifts in the head, leading astronauts to crave spicy, bold flavors, hot sauce, curry, mustard. They savor these bursts of sensation not just for the flavor, but for the fleeting illusion of normalcy. Dining together becomes a small act of humanity, a ritual that breaks the monotony of machine rhythms. The shared floating table, the laughter as droplets drift between crewmates, it's as close to home as they can get, thousands of miles above it. Fact 7. Sleep in orbit is an act of surrender that never fully succeeds. Astronauts strap themselves into sleeping bags tethered to walls or ceilings, though there's no up or down. They close their eyes as the station circles the planet. 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets streaming past in each Earth day. Circadian rhythms lose meaning, disrupted by the endless alternation of light and dark. The body craves stillness, but the mind resists it. Pumps hum, fans whisper, and faint vibrations ripple through the hull. Some astronauts drift off easily, floating in place, while others lie awake for hours, conscious of every sound and movement. Dreams, when they come, are often vivid, and strange gravity returns. The ground feels both familiar and alien. Upon waking, the first instinct is to roll over, to sit up, but there's no floor to meet you, only air and light and the slow spin of a world far below. Fact 80. Communication with Earth voices over static, digital video feeds. Text messages anchors astronauts to home. Yet, even with near-instant connectivity, the psychological distance is immense. The delay between question and response, the faint echo of one's own voice returning from orbit, remind the crew how far away they truly are. Birthdays, holidays, family milestones, these unfold on Earth, while the astronauts watch from a machine orbiting hundreds of miles above. Ground control becomes both guardian and companion, guiding them through routines and emergencies alike, a calm voice from the blue planet below. But after months in space, some astronauts begin to feel a strange detachment. Earth becomes a concept, not a place. They can see it constantly, dazzling and unreachable, yet the emotional threads that bind them to it grow thin, stretched by distance and silence. For many, The first call home after landing is wordless, just breathing, listening to another heartbeat at the other end of gravity. Fact 80. Cleaning the body in microgravity is an exercise in ingenuity and patience. Without showers, astronauts rely on rinseless wipes, no-rinse shampoo, and minimal water, carefully applied and then captured to prevent droplets from floating into electronics. The station's water supply is precious, every molecule recycled from air moisture, sweat, and even urine. The closed-loop system means that yesterday's breath or perspiration may become tomorrow's drinking water. Hygiene is both a technical and psychological necessity. Feeling clean maintains morale, a fragile defense against isolation. But even so, the body adapts in unexpected ways. Oil production changes, skin becomes hypersensitive, cuts heal differently. The smell of humanity mingles with the sterile scent of machinery, a reminder that even in the most advanced environment ever built, life remains unmistakably organic, persistent, and imperfect. Fact 80. Exercise is as vital as oxygen in orbit. Without gravity, muscles atrophy rapidly and bones lose calcium at alarming rates. To counter this, astronauts spend about 2 hours a day on treadmills, stationary bicycles, and resistance machines that simulate weight through vacuum or elastic tension. Running in place while tethered to a treadmill, an astronaut feels their body trying to remember gravity's pull. Sweat forms spheres that cling to the skin instead of falling away. Heart rate soars as the body fights a constant illusion of effort without load. But exercise is more than preservation, it's therapy. It restores rhythm, provides measurable progress in a world where every other variable drifts. The sound of feet striking the treadmill, the pull of simulated weights, the brief illusion of heaviness, these are not just physical necessities, but emotional lifelines that reconnect the crew, if only for moments, to the planet where effort once meant motion. Fact 80. Tools in space must obey different rules of design. Ordinary wrenches and drills behave unpredictably in microgravity. Every twist or torque can send the astronaut spinning in the opposite direction. Tools are tethered to belts, equipped with Velcro, magnets, or restraint systems. The smallest slip can send a crucial object drifting away, lost forever in orbit. Engineers on Earth design custom instruments for specific repairs, tested repeatedly in underwater simulations that mimic zero. During actual repairs, astronauts rely on checklists, voice guidance, and the muscle memory of countless rehearsals. Yet, when something fails unexpectedly, a jammed valve, a stuck bolt, the moment becomes improvisational theater at the edge of survival. The line between routine maintenance and crisis can vanish in seconds, and there is no hardware store in orbit. Each successful fix, no matter how small, feels monumental, a reminder that even in the vacuum, human hands still matter. Fact 8. Space radiation is invisible, omnipresent, and inescapable. Outside Earth's magnetic field, high-energy particles from the Sun and distant stars bombard the body, passing through cells, altering DNA, increasing long-term cancer risks. The station's hull provides partial shielding, but not enough to erase exposure entirely. During solar storms, astronauts retreat to the most shielded modules, where water tanks and supplies form a crude barrier. They feel nothing, no heat, no sound, but instruments spike, and ground control warns them to stay put. Over time, Cumulative radiation subtly alters vision, accelerates cataracts, and may even affect cognitive function. Some astronauts report brief flashes of light when their eyes are closed, cosmic rays striking retinal cells directly. It's a haunting reminder that space is not a vacuum of nothingness, but a storm of invisible violence, a constant rain of particles through which every human who ventures beyond Earth must pass, protected only by layers of metal, water, and faith in physics. Fact 8. Spacecraft are designed for efficiency, not comfort, and every cubic centimeter is accounted for. On the International Space Station, there are no rooms in the terrestrial sense-only compartments, modules, and narrow passageways filled with cables, panels, and equipment. The air is filtered, the temperature regulated, and the lighting carefully tuned to mimic Earth's rhythms. Yet the station always feels mechanical, humming with purpose. Privacy barely exists. Sound travels easily through thin walls. Astronauts learn to find solitude in small rituals, listening to music through headphones, staring out a window, or recording private messages to family. The absence of personal space changes behavior. Tempers flare faster. Small irritations magnify, and interpersonal harmony becomes a skill as crucial as technical competence. Living in orbit is not only about surviving physics, it's about managing proximity, adapting to constant company in a place where you can't step outside for air. Fact 8. Windows in spacecraft are both a luxury and a lifeline. The cupola module aboard the ISS, with its 7 panes of reinforced glass, is humanity's most extraordinary window seat. From there, astronauts witness the planet in breathtaking detail, thunderstorms flashing like veins of electricity, auroras flowing like liquid silk, city lights tracing the outlines of civilization. They photograph coastlines, mountain ranges, and night skies where stars never twinkle. Yet, the view also carries emotional weight. Some astronauts report feeling overwhelming loneliness while gazing down at Earth so close and yet impossibly far. Others describe it as meditative, a daily renewal of purpose. The window becomes a psychological anchor, proof of beauty amid machinery. It's the place where humans remember why they came to see, to learn, to feel the fragile majesty of the world they left behind. Fact 8. Every sound on the station has meaning. The hum of ventilation fans, the rhythmic pulse of pumps, the soft beeping of monitors all signal life and stability. When something changes, a pitch shifts, a tone falters, it draws instant attention. Silence, paradoxically, is dangerous. Astronauts are trained to detect and interpret these sounds instinctively. A high-pitched whine might indicate a failing bearing. A muffled thud could mean equipment shifting due to air pressure changes. Sound is as vital as sight in this mechanical ecosystem, but it is also a companion. Many astronauts leave equipment running deliberately while they sleep, finding comfort in the steady background noise, the artificial heartbeat of the station. When they return to Earth, true silence feels alien, an absence that echoes louder than any alarm ever did. Fact 8. The body's internal clock struggles in orbit. Without a consistent sunrise or sunset, circadian rhythms lose their reference points, disrupting sleep, metabolism, and mood. Lights aboard the station are programmable, shifting color temperature throughout the day to simulate natural light cycles: cool blue in the morning, warm amber in the evening. Even so, many astronauts experience chronic fatigue and mild insomnia. Melatonin supplements help, but the deeper issue is psychological. Time itself loses its shape. The station orbits Earth every 90 minutes, so in a single day, crew members witness 16 dawns and 16 dusks. The human mind, evolved under a steady sky, can't fully adapt. Some astronauts report dreaming in fragments, as if their subconscious is trying to reconcile conflicting cycles. The adjustment continues even after returning home, where gravity and sunlight, once taken for granted, feel strange and new. Fact 8. Isolation in space is not just physical, it's emotional and existential. Cut off from the rhythms of Earth, astronauts live in a world of endless machinery and procedure. Every task is scheduled, every moment accounted for. Yet loneliness seeps through the gaps in routine. Birthdays, family milestones, and global events unfold below, beyond reach. Communication delays and limited bandwidth mean conversations with loved ones are brief, filtered through technology. Some astronauts cope through humor and camaraderie. Others turn inward, relying on journals, music, or creative outlets to maintain balance. Psychological support from ground teams is vital. Regular check-ins, counseling, and messages from home. But ultimately, every astronaut faces moments of solitude that no mission training can prepare them for. It is in those moments, floating alone in a module, the planet turning silently below, that the vastness of existence feels most tangible and most humbling. Fact 90. The process of returning to gravity after months in orbit is as painful as it is buoyant. Muscles that once held strength now tremble. The vestibular system reels as the body relearns balance. Standing upright becomes an act of endurance. Fluids rush back to the lower body, causing dizziness, nausea, and weakness. Astronauts describe feeling as though their bones are made of lead. Every step an argument between will and biology. Rehabilitation begins immediately: physical therapy, cardiovascular training, gradual reconditioning. Some recover within weeks. Others take months. The simple act of walking on grass or feeling rain becomes deeply emotional. For many, gravity itself feels like a living thing, oppressive, grounding, familiar. They have traveled farther than most humans ever will, but it is Earth's pull, constant and silent, that finally welcomes them home. Fact 91. Re-entry is a controlled fall through fire. When a spacecraft descends from orbit, it must shed tens of thousands of miles per hour of velocity within minutes. Friction with the atmosphere transforms kinetic energy into heat plasma temperatures exceeding 2000 degrees Fahrenheit. The capsule glows, shudders, and roars as shock waves envelop it. Inside, the crew feels crushing G-forces pressing them into their seats, vision narrowing, breath strained. The outside world vanishes in flame and vibration. Communication blackouts occur as ionized air blocks radio signals, leaving only the sound of the capsule groaning against air's resistance. Then, parachutes deploy with bone-jarring force, slowing the descent. The ground rises fast, to fast-stand the impact, though planned, is violent. Silence follows, then the hiss of wind through the open hatch. Cool air rushes in, heavy with the scent of soil and life. For the first time in months, gravity holds them again. Fact 92. Space debris is one of the greatest long-term dangers to orbital missions. Millions of fragments, from lost bolts to shattered satellites, circle Earth at speeds exceeding 17,000 miles per hour. Even a flake of paint can strike with the force of a bullet. The ISS can maneuver to avoid tracked debris, but smaller pieces go unseen, invisible hazards racing through darkness. Each close approach triggers tense hours of monitoring, sometimes forcing the crew into escape vehicles, ready to abandon the station if collision seems inevitable. Every orbit carries risk, and each new launch adds more fragments to the growing cloud surrounding the planet. Fact 93. Spacesuits are essentially miniature spacecraft, each one a self-contained life support system designed to keep a human alive in vacuum. They regulate temperature, provide oxygen, remove carbon dioxide, and protect against micrometeoroids and radiation. But they're cumbersome, over 200 pounds when fully equipped on Earth, and require astronauts to move with slow, deliberate precision. Even small tasks, like tightening a bolt, demand immense effort. Every spacewalk ends in exhaustion, with fingernails bruised, muscles sore, and sweat floating inside the helmet. Yet, despite the strain, astronauts often describe it as the purest experience of flight. Unfiltered contact with the cosmos. Fact 94. Spacecraft navigation relies on mathematics and patience. Without air, wings, or rudders, maneuvering is achieved by firing small thrusters, controlled bursts that alter velocity by fractions of a meter per second. Every action has equal and opposite reaction. There's no drifting stop. The crew and ground teams must calculate each move precisely, because mistakes accumulate quickly. Too much thrust, and they overshoot a rendezvous. Too little, and they miss it entirely. In orbit, motion is counterintuitive. To slow down, you speed up. To go higher, you accelerate forward. Mastering this dance of inertia is essential, and every correction is a reminder that space obeys rules both elegant and unforgiving. Fact 9. Fire behaves differently in much. Instead of rising, flames form perfect spheres, glowing blue and ghostly. They burn slower and cooler, with chemical reactions that wouldn't occur on Earth. NASA studies these flame balls in controlled experiments to understand combustion in new ways. But an uncontrolled fire remains one of the most feared events aboard a spacecraft. Without gravity to carry smoke upward, it spreads in all directions, obscuring vision and choking air filters. The only defense is immediate isolation of the fire and rapid use of extinguishers, because in orbit, there's nowhere to run. Fact 96. Space medicine deals with ailments that behave differently beyond Earth without gravity. Fluids shift toward the head, sinuses swell, and medications absorb unpredictably. A common cold becomes an ordeal. Infections spread more easily, and wounds heal slower. Doctors on Earth guide astronauts through medical procedures using live videos, while specialized kits on board contain everything from defibrillators to ultrasound scanners. Every crew member is trained in emergency surgery, though the hope is never to use it. Spaceflight turns medicine into improvisation, and the thin line between stability and crisis depends on calm. Practiced hands floating in zero gravity. Fact 97. Robots have become silent crewmates aboard the ISS. Canadarm2, a massive robotic arm, performs delicate operations outside the station, capturing cargo vehicles, positioning astronauts, or manipulating equipment too dangerous for humans. Inside, smaller robots assist with inventory, inspections, and even companionship. These systems extend human capability, working tirelessly in conditions that would exhaust or endanger their creators. But they also highlight a truth about modern exploration. The partnership between human intuition and machine precision is what makes survival in orbit possible. Fact 90. Every launch marks the culmination of years of work and seconds of risk. The roar of engines, the shaking cabin, the surge of acceleration. It's a moment of total surrender to physics. The rocket burns through stages, discarding spent boosters like discarded armor, each separation a thunderous jolt. Then, silence, weightlessness, the transition from crushing G-forces to floating freedom happens in an instant. Astronauts often describe it as both violent and transcendent. One heartbeat, you're pressed into your seat. The next, you're suspended above the world, Earth curving below, impossibly blue and fragile. Fact 99. The air aboard a spacecraft is an engineered balance, constantly monitored for oxygen, carbon dioxide, and trace contaminants. Machines scrub out CO using lithium hydroxide canisters or regenerative filters, while oxygen is generated by electrolysis of water. Even tiny imbalances can cause headaches, fatigue, or impaired judgment. Astronauts carry portable sensors to check local air quality, and every breath is the product of human ingenuity, air that has been filtered, purified, and recycled countless times. The smell of the station, metallic and dry, reminds them daily that breathing in space is never natural. It's technology continuously keeping them alive. Fact 100. The first minutes after reaching orbit are a sensory shock. Straps loosen, pens drift, and the body loses its sense of direction. Objects float lazily, and even simple actions, turning a screw, pouring water, brushing hair, demand conscious effort. The vestibular system, used to gravity, rebels. Nausea sets in, a rite of passage called space adaptation syndrome. Some adapt within hours. Others take days. But when the sickness fades, so does the strangeness, and what once felt alien becomes second nature. Moving through air like a swimmer, pushing off walls with fingertips, it becomes the closest thing to flight a human can feel. And so ends 100 facts about life in space, 100 glimpses into the reality behind the dream, the danger, the discipline, the awe. Every statistic hides a story. Every fact, a heartbeat. We look up at the stars and imagine distance. But for the few who've gone, it isn't distance they remember. It's fragility. It's silence. It's the sight of Earth, bright, delicate, alone, and the realization that home is not the blue planet below, but the life that binds us all to it.